In the sterile, climate-controlled silence of the Joint Operations Center, modern war does not look like a battlefield. It looks like a high-stakes trading floor. The walls are lined with monolithic plasma screens, each one pulsating with a relentless, synchronized stream of data, telemetry, drone feeds, and the heartbeat of every friendly asset in the theater. In the center of the largest screen, there is a single glowing green pixel. It is the icon for a Blue Force Tracker, BFT, unit, attached to a high-value informant who has spent months embedding himself deep within the insurgent networks of Baghdad's ancient labyrinthine districts. To the American command staff, that green dot is not just data. It is a manifestation of total, godlike control. It represents the ability to see through the fog of war, to pin a person to a coordinate, and to dictate the terms of engagement from a distance of miles. It is the digital tether that connects the commander to his intelligence, promising a level of visibility that history has never before afforded a military force. But in the spring of 2006, the promise of that green pixel began to unravel. Without warning, the pulsing icon on the main screen froze. It didn't flicker, it didn't drift, it simply stopped. In the frantic seconds that followed, the operations center shifted from calm analysis to a state of high-octane crisis management. The Quick Reaction Force, QRF, a unit designed to deploy with the speed of a reflex, was scrambled. Within minutes, a line of Stryker armored vehicles tore through the narrow, debris-choked streets of the target district, their heavy tires grinding against the remains of 1,000 years of masonry. The breach teams, perfectly rehearsed and operating with the lethal precision of a surgical strike, hit the target building at the exact GPS coordinates transmitted by the tracker. The door was blown inward in a cloud of dust and acoustic shock. The operators flowed into the room with weapons raised, ready to secure the informant and extract him before the enemy could mount a response. The room was empty. There was no informant. There was no insurgent cell. There was nothing but the heavy, stagnant air of an abandoned apartment. And, lying on the floor next to a rusted sewer drain, the small, black, and utterly silent transmitter. The realization settled over the operators with the cold weight of a physical blow. They had been tracking the transmitter, not the man. The insurgents had discovered the Americans' addiction to the digital signal, and they had turned it into a weapon of misdirection. By clipping the device to a sewer pipe, they had kept the American command tethered to a lie, forcing the most powerful military machine on the planet to expend its most valuable assets, chasing a ghost. The American operators stood in the middle of that room, their heads turning as they tried to make sense of the void. They were surrounded by the city, a place of 2,000 years of history, a dense, claustrophobic maze of walls that had been built, destroyed, and rebuilt over 100 generations. They were standing in a place where the GPS coordinates they relied on were constantly bouncing off concrete, where the satellite view from above was nothing more than a series of rooftops, and where the God's eye view, provided by their technology, had failed to see what was happening on the ground. They weren't just in the wrong room. They were operating in a reality that their digital doctrine was fundamentally incapable of processing. This failure wasn't the result of a botched mission or a lack of bravery. The men who breached that door were elite, highly trained, and prepared to give their lives for the success of the operation. The failure was structural. It was the result of a military machine that had convinced itself that it could digitize the battlefield, that it could solve the chaos of human conflict by treating it as a complex computational problem. The American doctrine of the green pixel, the belief that if you have enough sensors, enough data, and enough resolution, you can strip away the uncertainty of war, had been exposed as an illusion. The city of Baghdad was not a digital grid. It was an analog organism, one that reacted to the Americans' digital presence by hiding, shifting, and reconfiguring itself in ways that the satellite feeds could not track and the GPS could not anticipate. For the American command, the blank screen wasn't just a technical glitch. It was a profound professional crisis. They had spent years building an apparatus that was designed to eliminate the fog of war. They had convinced themselves that they could make the battlefield transparent. But in that moment, in that empty, silent room, they were forced to confront the fact that their technology hadn't eliminated the fog. It had only changed its color. They were looking for a green pixel, but the enemy was a human being, and the human being was nowhere to be found. When you make digital surveillance the foundation of your tactical reality, the moment you lose the signal, you lose the ability to act. The Americans were paralyzed because they had forgotten how to look at the world without a screen telling them what they were seeing. They had outsourced their perception to the satellite, their logic to the algorithm, and their decision-making to the network. And when that network was bypassed, they were left with nothing but their heavy boots and their confusion. They were the most informed army in history, and yet they were profoundly, dangerously blind. If you are interested in the anatomy of modern conflict and how the reality of the ground forces doctrine to break and reform, subscribe to the channel. We are exploring the hidden history of these tactical failures, not to criticize the men on the ground, who are always the ones to pay the price, but to understand why even the most advanced military machine in history can be brought to its knees by the simple, brutal reality of a maze. This story is not just about a botched raid or a tactical error. It is about the structural arrogance of systems that prioritize the comfort of the digital view over the harsh, unvarnished truth of the physical ground. We are about to strip away the myths surrounding the American approach to these crises and look at the alternative, a philosophy of war that treats technology not as a guide, but as a potential liability. We will analyze why the traditional American response failed, the deep, institutional roots of their reliance on the green pixel, and the moment when the military reality demanded a new, much more human set of rules. As we move into the next chapter, we will see how the obsession with the screen blinded the command to the only solution that could get them inside the maze. A solution that involved stepping away from the monitors, walking into the city in the dark, and relearning how to find a human being when you aren't being watched by a satellite. Stay with us as we dismantle the logic of the pixel. The American reliance on the Blue Force tracker and the digital situational awareness suite was not a failure of intelligence. It was a crowning achievement of modern military science. It was the result of a paradigm shift that sought to eliminate the fog of war, that ancient historical variable that had defined military conflict for millennia. By digitizing the battlefield, the US military aimed to replace the uncertainty of individual perception with the mathematical certainty of the network. In the vast, open expanses of the Iraqi desert or the high, clear valleys of Afghanistan, this system was a revelation. It allowed commanders to synchronize maneuver elements across hundreds of miles, prevent fratricide with surgical precision, and visualize the battlefield as a chess match, where every piece was accounted for in real time. It was the ultimate logistical and tactical safety net, designed to ensure that the soldier on the ground was never truly isolated, never truly lost, and never truly without the support of the entire national apparatus. However, the logic of the digital matrix was predicated on a fundamental assumption: that the battlefield could be rendered transparent. In open terrain, this assumption holds. In the desert, there are no obstructions to the signal, no clutter to confuse the sensor, and no density to dissipate the reach of the network. But when that same doctrine was transported into the heart of Old Baghdad, it hit a wall of spatial entropy. The city was not an open grid. It was an ancient, tangled organism. It was a place where 2,000 years of construction, deconstruction, and relayering had created a canyon of concrete and rebar that defied the very physics of digital communication. The American commanders were attempting to overlay a high-fidelity digital map onto a reality that was inherently analog, chaotic, and fluid. The GPS signals that provided such pinpoint accuracy in the desert were subject to multi-path interference in the city, bouncing off buildings, dead-ending in basements, and scattering into useless noise. The green pixel that told the commander where his team was located was, in many cases, a mathematical approximation that lagged behind the physical reality of a soldier moving through a dark, turning corridor. The Americans had optimized their entire tactical process for a world that was flat and transparent, only to find themselves fighting in a world that was deep, jagged, and opaque. The most insidious effect of this doctrine was not technical, it was psychological. The US operators had been trained to view the screen as the final arbiter of truth. They had been taught that if the monitor showed a building was empty, then it was empty. If the tracker showed their position was secure, then it was secure. They had systematically offloaded their intuition, their ability to read the ambient cues of a street, the tension in the air, the subtle patterns of civilian behavior, to the sensors and the satellites. They had become extensions of the interface. When the interface failed, they were not just missing data, they were missing the ability to perceive the threat. They had become dependent on a digital crutch, and when that crutch was kicked away, they couldn't stand on their own. They were fighting a war of pixels, while the enemy was fighting a war of mortar, brick, and intent. The insurgents, who operated entirely outside the electronic spectrum, understood the city as a physical reality. They knew that the Americans were slaves to the screen. They understood that the Americans would only move when the system told them to, and that they would only trust what they could see on a digital overlay. By manipulating the signal, by placing transmitters in sewer pipes or abandoning gear to create false patterns, they forced the Americans to chase ghosts through a labyrinth. The Americans were looking at a screen, seeing a simulated representation of the war, while the actual war was happening in the blind spots that the sensors couldn't reach. This was the concrete trap. It was the realization that a system designed to provide total visibility had in fact created a blind spot of catastrophic proportions. The commanders in the operations center felt a false sense of security because the dashboard was green, unaware that the physical situation on the ground was spiraling into chaos. They were managing a simulation of the battle, not the battle itself. They had built a military machine that was brilliant at processing information, but fundamentally inadequate at understanding human environment. The more they relied on the matrix, the less they understood the reality. They were standing in the middle of a war zone, surrounded by 1 million people, yet they were effectively alone, trapped in a digital bubble that prevented them from seeing the very danger that was standing in the doorway. The US doctrine was trying to impose order on a system that thrived on chaos, and in the process, they had forgotten the most important rule of urban combat. The city is not a map. The city is a living thing. The American forces were fighting the ghosts of their own projections, and the more they tried to force the digital truth onto the analog environment, the more they fell into the trap that the city had laid for them. They were waiting for a green pixel to save them, unaware that in the ancient streets of Baghdad, the only thing that could save them was the very thing they had discarded: the ability to see, to sense, and to understand without a digital intermediary. The matrix had failed, and now they were left with the unforgiving silence of the labyrinth, forced to confront the fact that their billion-dollar view of the battlefield was nothing more than a curtain drawn over a reality they had stopped trying to understand.
The Joint Operations Center at the base in Baghdad was not just a hub of activity. It was a cathedral of digital faith. The American commander, a veteran of several tours, stood at the center of this cathedral, watching the wall of monitors with a growing sense of professional unease. His team had lost the informant. The digital tether, the green pixel, had been cut, and the city had swallowed his intelligence asset whole. His instinct, sharpened by years of training in high-intensity maneuver warfare, was to overwhelm the loss with volume. He was already planning a sector search, a systematic high-intensity sweep of the district. It would involve cordon and search operations, the use of heavy-lift transport, and a massive deployment of infantry to lock down the area. It was a kinetic, loud, and uncompromising solution.
He believed that if you turned every stone in the district, the truth would have nowhere to hide. But the commander knew the cost. A sector search in a dense, hostile neighborhood in Baghdad was not a surgical operation. It was a blunt instrument. It meant breaching dozens of homes, provoking the local population, and engaging in a series of close-quarters skirmishes that would almost certainly result in collateral damage and, quite possibly, the death of the very informant he was trying to save. It was the only way he knew how to reclaim the initiative, yet every part of his experience told him that this specific solution would be a strategic disaster. He was trapped between the failure of his technology and the unacceptable brutality of his only remaining conventional option. Standing in the periphery, his presence muted by the frantic energy of the staff, was the British SAS liaison officer. He had been a silent observer throughout the crisis, watching the American staff attempt to force a digital solution onto an analog problem. He didn't see a blacked-out sector that needed to be saturated with force. He saw a labyrinth that needed to be understood. He stepped forward to the digital table and, instead of pulling up a satellite feed or checking a sensor array, he reached into his tactical vest. He didn't pull out a laser pointer or an encrypted handset. He placed a small, simple, white piece of chalk onto the glass surface of the monitor. The American staff went quiet. They looked at the chalk as if it were a foreign object, a piece of detritus that had no business in a modern command center. The SAS officer spoke with a quiet, devastating calm. He proposed that the American plan to search the district was not a rescue mission, but a declaration of war that would ensure the death of their asset. He argued that searching a city from the outside in was fundamentally backwards. You couldn't dominate the labyrinth by breaking it. You had to navigate it. He proposed that 2 operators enter the district on foot, in civilian clothing, with no electronic signature and no heavy gear. Their objective was not to search the district in the conventional sense, but to infiltrate the network of the labyrinth itself. The SAS plan relied on an archaic, almost primitive concept: the physical marker. The operators would navigate the back alleys, identifying the nodes of the insurgent presence, not by electronic signals, but by observing the patterns of the street, the social signals, the subtle indicators of movement, and the physical evidence of the informant's passage. As they moved through the maze, they would mark the route with discreet, nearly invisible chalk symbols. A line here, a notch there, that would guide the extraction team in behind them, completely bypassing the insurgent-controlled checkpoints. To the American commander, this was a violation of every safety protocol his career had taught him to hold sacred. He asked how the SAS could justify such an exposure. "You're talking about sending 2 men into the heart of a hostile sector with nothing but a piece of chalk. How do you expect to communicate? How do you expect to call for help if the sector goes hot? You're stripping away every safety net that the US military has spent billions to create." The SAS officer's reply was a direct challenge to the Americans' definition of safety.
He argued that the American safety nets were the very things that had made them predictable and visible. The safety of a radio call was a beacon. The safety of a cordon was a provocation. The safety of a sector search was a guarantee of a firefight. The British didn't see their lack of support as a deficiency. They saw it as the ultimate form of stealth. They were proposing to turn the city's own geography into their armor.
They were betting that if they could remain unnoticed, they didn't need the extraction team to be a force of destruction. They only needed the extraction team to be a ghost. The clash of paradigms was total. The American commander was fighting a battle of visibility, trying to force the city to reveal itself through the light of his senses. The British officer was fighting a battle of invisibility, trying to hide himself within the city's shadows. The commander looked at the chalk, a symbol of the manual, the physical and the deliberate. He knew that if he accepted the SAS plan, he would be rejecting the entire infrastructure of his command. He would be admitting that the most powerful network in human history had been defeated by a man with a piece of chalk. But he also knew that the alternative, the massive, loud, destructive sector search, was a confession of his own impotence. It was the hammer solution, and he knew it wouldn't bring the informant home. He looked at the SAS officer, seeing in his eyes the calm confidence of a man who had walked these kinds of mazes for his entire career. He realized that for all the billions spent on the screens and the pixels, he had never learned how to actually see the city. He was an officer of the simulation, and the British officer was a master of the ground. He gave the order. The room felt suddenly hollow as the decision took hold. The frantic, high-tech energy of the search mission was replaced by a grim, deliberate preparation. The American staff, usually so focused on the telemetry of their assets, were now forced to watch as two men prepared to go into the dark, armed with nothing but their instincts and a small, white piece of rock. They were witnessing the moment the digital certainty of their doctrine collided with the physical uncertainty of the labyrinth. If you are interested in the evolution of special operations from the era of mass digital surveillance to the era of tactical, analog intuition, subscribe to the channel where we continue to deconstruct the myths of the battlefield and look at the moments where the old ways died. We are about to watch the two-man team approach the most dangerous district in Baghdad. Not with the God's eye view of the satellite, but with the quiet, deliberate, and entirely manual guidance of a piece of chalk. Stay with us as we witness the paradox of the analog raid in the heart of the digital war. The two operatives did not cross the district perimeter with the high-profile aggression of a dedicated breach team. They entered like a subtle shift in the city's nocturnal atmosphere. They wore civilian clothing that matched the local aesthetic, not a costume, but a calculated camouflage that rendered them invisible to the casual observer. They carried no electronic signatures. Their radios were powered down, their GPS receivers left behind in the armory, and their movements were dictated by a deep, internalized understanding of the city's urban geometry. They didn't move through the streets as a threat to be managed. They moved through them as part of the background noise. Inside the Joint Operations Center, the American staff were staring at a wall of blank monitors. The green pixel was gone. They were experiencing a complete loss of situational awareness, a sensory deprivation that their system was never designed to endure. They felt the weight of the city as an unreadable, impenetrable mass. They were waiting for the radio to crackle, for a thermal drone to pick up a heat signature, or for a movement pattern to emerge on the electronic overlay. But the SAS team was operating in a domain that the sensors could not map, the domain of the physical signifier. As the British team navigated the labyrinth of the old district, they were not looking for data streams. They were looking for the analog signatures of human habitation and movement. They noted the silence of a street that should have been active. They observed the absence of stray animals near a specific residential block, a sign of human activity that the drone's thermal optics, cluttered by the ambient heat of the city, had ignored. They were reading the city's social geography. Every street corner, every dead-end alley, and every darkened doorway was a piece of information, analyzed and discarded with the clinical detachment of a chess player. When they found the basement where the informant was held, it was not through a digital alert, but through the observation of a subtle, inconsistent pattern in the local traffic. A vehicle, parked at an angle that shielded its license plate from the main thoroughfare, and 2 men standing in the shadows of a doorway, their posture betraying the tension of a guard detail rather than the idleness of a resident. It was a detail so small that an algorithm would have filtered it out as noise. To the SAS operators, it was the only piece of information that mattered. They did not call for air support. They did not request a fire mission. They moved to the perimeter of the target building and began to work. This was where the chalk became the primary tool of the operation. As they scouted the route back to the extraction point, they marked the path with small, jagged white lines on the corner of the brickwork. Not crude graffiti, but specific, coded vectors that would guide the follow-on team through the most secure, least defensible path. A vertical slash indicated a turn. A horizontal line signaled a high-risk sector. A specific pattern of dots denoted the safe alleyway that avoided the insurgent picket lines. It was an ingenious act of low-tech navigation. By marking the route, they created a physical, tactile map that existed only in the real world. An insurgent walking past the brickwork might see a random scuff of white chalk, but to the follow-on American team, trained to identify the marks, it was a precise turn-by-turn navigation system. The SAS team had essentially turned the city itself into their operational map, carving their path into the architecture of the district. The extraction team, watching the sector through the grainy optics of a drone that was desperately trying to make sense of the empty streets, finally saw the marks. They didn't see the SAS operators who were already shadows in the distance, but they saw the route. They followed the white chalk marks, turning down alleyways that the command staff had deemed high risk, moving through sections of the market that the sensors had flagged as hostile. Every turn confirmed the SAS team's logic. Every marker was a proof of concept that the physical world was a better guide than the digital simulation. They reached the basement, moved into the blind spots of the rebel security, and extracted the informant with a speed that the digital monitors couldn't even register. By the time the American QRF had reached the building, the SAS team and the informant were already blocks away, blending back into the flow of the city's nocturnal life. The rebel militia remained at their posts, watching the empty street, completely unaware that the asset they had been guarding had been removed from beneath their feet. The American staff in the TOC watched the monitors with a dawning, uncomfortable realization. The screens had been blank for the entire duration of the extraction. The high-tech, billion-dollar network had provided zero value. They had won the mission not because their technology had succeeded, but because they had finally stopped relying on it. They had followed a path drawn in chalk, through a labyrinth they couldn't map, and they had succeeded by using the only sensor that actually mattered: the human eye, guided by the cold, tactical intellect of a soldier who understood that in the maze of the city, the only true way to navigate is to leave the screen behind and follow the marks on the wall. The dawn light that filtered into the Joint Operations Center was thin, clinical, and unforgiving. It stripped away the artificial glow of the monitors, revealing the fatigue etched into the faces of the American staff. The extraction was complete. The informant was secured, processed, and moved to a deep site holding facility before the city had fully woken to the morning call to prayer. In the center of the room, the American commander stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the British operator who was quietly stowing his gear.
The operator's fingers were still marked with the white, powdery residue of the chalk he had used to map the labyrinth. A stark, ghostly contrast to the vibrant, artificial green of the tactical displays. On the commander's table, resting next to his own ruggedized, multi-thousand-dollar tablet, lay the small, broken stub of that white chalk. It was a visual summation of a paradigm shift. He looked from his tools of absolute digital dominance, the high-definition streams, the real-time GPS overlays, the encrypted data links, to the simple, unrefined material that had actually navigated the target area. The realization was not a sudden burst of anger, but a slow, cold descent into a reality he had been trained to ignore. He had been fighting the map, while the British had been fighting the territory. He had spent his entire career believing that the ultimate display of tactical control was the ability to saturate the battlefield with data. He now understood that the true pinnacle of that control was the ability to navigate the environment when the data ceased to exist. The British operator didn't offer a lecture, nor did he boast about the ease of the infiltration. He simply packed his gear, acknowledging the American officer with a brief, professional nod that contained neither arrogance nor pity.
It was the recognition of one technician for another, a quiet acknowledgement that the American military machine was beginning to learn the hardest lesson of all, that in an asymmetric urban conflict, the most lethal signature you can project is not the precision of your sensors, but the depth of your presence. The high-tech network, which the Americans had treated as the ultimate expression of their superiority, had actually been their greatest vulnerability. A loud, rigid, and ultimately fragile system that had stripped them of the only advantage that mattered in a city of millions: the ability to exist within the fabric of the maze. This was the institutional pivot point. For the American command, the mission became a masterclass in the necessity of tactical refinement. They saw, in the empty, silent streets marked only by the white lines of the chalk, a template for their own evolution. They began to dismantle the rigid, screen-centric doctrine they had clung to for decades, recognizing that the green pixel was not just a geographic guide, but a cognitive cage. They started to incorporate the techniques of manual navigation, the patience of physical observation, and the discipline of the low-signature approach, moving away from the digital dependency that had become their hallmark and toward a doctrine of precision that valued the integrity of the soldier's intuition over the velocity of the data stream. The legacy of that night and the white, jagged lines that had guided the team through the most dangerous district in the city would ripple through the special operations community long after the war concluded. It became a piece of foundational lore, a story told in the quiet corners of training facilities, a reminder that the most sophisticated weapons in the world are ultimately subordinate to the mind of the operator. The American military didn't stop using satellites, and they didn't abandon their commitment to network-centric warfare, but they learned the value of the silence. They learned that there is a profound tactical power in the ability to wait, to observe, and to navigate the world with the clinical, unassisted detachment of a man who knows his own way. As the team prepared for their next rotation, the American commander left the piece of chalk on the desk, no longer seeing it as a piece of refuse, but as a tool with a specific tactical utility. He had stopped viewing the city as a simulation to be solved and started seeing it as a physical system to be understood. The raid had rewritten his understanding of what it meant to be a professional soldier. He had finally recognized that the true master of the battlefield is not the one who can project the most data, but the one who can operate when the monitors go dark. The era of the all-seeing warrior was not dead, but it had been humbled, brought to its knees by the cold, manual precision of a piece of chalk. The tool that had proven that when you are fighting for the control of a city, the most sophisticated instrument in your arsenal isn't the one that beams the target, but the one that allows you to see the path.
The digital tether was cut. The screen was blank, and for the first time, he was finally ready to fight in the real world.